small college in Kalamazoo, Michigan. For me, maybe more importantly, was that one, it was the home of, or is the home of Bell's Brewery, Kalamazoo Brewing Company. So my first exposure to craft beer was Larry Bell's beers. In fact, my very first craft beer I ever had was a Bell's Porter, which inspired me to homebrew, and I became somewhat obsessed with homebrewing, to say the least. We got to the point where we were brewing 4 to 5 times a week, providing beer for the local fraternities, the Western University fraternity. So I know homebrewing well from then, and I'm always amazed at how the technology has increased. I look through beer and more beer sites and all the other things like that. And I never had that. Temperature controllers and all that. But so what basically happened is I started homebrewing a little before I was 21 in college. And then I got an internship, which later turned into a full-time job at a spice extraction company, Kalamazoo Spice Extraction. And it just so happened they're making hop extracts and still do for larger breweries. We have a brewmaster on staff. His name is Rudy Held. He's a German-trained, Weinsteffen-trained, as German as they come. And he kind of took me under his arm. He knew I was homebrewing. And then one fateful day, they sent me to Siebel Institute of Brewing Technology to take some coursework. And then figured out, well, I can make money as a brewer, and I could do this on the homebrew for the fraternities, and ended up leaving CalSec about 3.5 years after starting. The position, I was an organic chemist, and my title was hops chemist. That was the actual title. My first time, my first job. And I later then went on and joined as an entry-level cellarman at the Goose Island Beer Company in Chicago. You can have that chair. You can pull more underneath. Entry-level cellarman at Goose Island Beer Company in 1995-96 when the Fulton Street facility first opened. I went from a brew pub to a production brewery. And in our first year of production brewing, we made 25,000 barrels a year. So here I went from home brewing, some lab stuff. Next thing I know, I'm filling 200-barrel fermenters with wood. And it was trial by fire, and my in was that I had a lab background. Everyone else had brewing knowledge. And so I set up the lab, became the QC, brewer, later passed that on to another employee, became kind of head of cellar, which 6 months later became head brewer at Goose Island. And when I left in 2000, we were up to about 50,000, 60,000 barrels a year. And then I got headhunted by Slow Brewing Company. So Mike Hoffman of Slow Brewing Company convinced me to come to the Central Coast and take over the Paso Robles facility. And 1 short year later, Adam and David came in and bought it and asked me to stay on, thankfully, as their brewer. So that's my story, and it all started with home brewing. This presentation, which like I said, we won't get all the way through, but I think it's interesting. And if there's, if people start yawning, I'll move faster into more interesting stuff. But because I had the background as a hop chemist, I later started working with Hop Growers of America. And Hop Growers of America is a non-for-profit group that's similar to the Brewers Association or the Home Brewers Association of America for hop growers. So basically, they pool resources together based on the size of their farms, and that money that they collect goes to trying to promote. One arm of it is to promote U.S. hops abroad. Another part of it goes to pest and mildew and figuring out ways of just handling the agronomics of hop growing. And lastly, it's breeding efforts. And we'll get a little bit more into that, but I think if you may already know this, but all the really popular varieties that are coming up, Mosaic, Simcoe, not that it's a new one, but some of these newer ones like those, hops, Citra, those came out of private breeding programs. They didn't come out of public breeding programs. So if you turn the clocks back a decade or two ago, almost every variety, Cascade, Centennial, Montford, all of those came out of public breeding programs. The USDA sponsored that, a lot of government funding. Hop Growers of America funded it. And once those plants proved themselves on the public program, they were freely dispersed to the growers. And so all growers had access to the genetics. And so brewers would call up certain varieties, growers would grow them, and the ebb and flow was based on a brewer's demand. Now, almost everything's coming out of private breeding programs. You'll notice that, Mosaic, trademark, Simcoe, trademark. Those are owned usually by a single grower to start with, or a group of growers. Hop Union, for instance, is a company that's owned by a group of growers, so they hold some trademarks. And it changes just like anything in big business, it kind of changes the landscape. That's why you see prices so high for the trademark or the private sector hops, while Cascades and some of the others are staying low. And I think over time, Amarillo is a great example. The Gamache farm came up with the genetics there. I don't know what they crossed. I don't know if that's public information. And then they held it very closely. In fact, they only grew it on their farm. And the demand became so high, and they had a couple catastrophic years where they didn't meet demand. They were forced to bring other farmers into the fold, but ultimately they're trying to control the genetics. We know as brewers, and thankfully, probably because of the Reinheitsgebot, but I think also because of just the pure nature of brewing, genetically modified plants, barley, sugars, and things of that nature are kind of unspoken but forbidden in our industry. So there aren't GMO brewing barleys, at least that are commercially traded. Same with hops. But certainly there's a lot of crossing and natural crosses that happen in that process. So it's very interesting.
Is that why some of the newer hops start off with a name like HBC 360?
Well, yes, to some degree, but if you follow it, and it's on this presentation, so it's fine to talk about the whole process of breeding, and I've never been involved in that side of it, but when you go to these greenhouses where they're crossing hops or any plant that they're trying to propagate and find new plants and pest resistance and all these things, they'll do hundreds if not thousands of crosses, and many times they'll have half the genetics are known, and then half of it's pollinated with a wild hop or some other male that they found, and then they end up with all these seeds or small plant, seeds. They replant those seeds, grow them, and try to see if first they have any bigger to grow, and then they eliminate a bunch. And so everything gets numbered. And so there's a vast array, a spreadsheet of numbers. And then the number that you're referring to is when it's finally whittled down to the point where, wow, we're going to do this. Let's see if some brewers like it first. And they present it as a number. And if people respond well, they're like, we need to give it a name. Things like that. So it's a fascinating world. So in any case, I digress here, but the whole concept here is Hop Growers of America is a non-for-profit organization that represents hop growers and supports their needs. They hired me, a brewer, to do the marketing side. And when I say marketing, I go abroad. I've traveled all over the world for Hop Growers of America. I've gone to Russia. I spent time in Brazil, Argentina, Chile. I've gone to most of the European nations. To talk to brewers. So sit in rooms like this and show this presentation and explain to people what differentiates U.S. growers or what U.S. hops are about, and then what differentiates U.S. growers from predominantly German growers, because that's what, we live in the United States and we're fascinated by U.S. hops, but almost everyone else in the world has been taught in European schools that Germans make the best hops. And we'll kind of see some of the landscape of all of that. So the presentation is an overview of the U.S. hop industry and craft brewing. Because I'm a craft brewer, I like to use it as an example of how U.S. hops has revitalized brewing and has become almost a focal point of our industry. And the craft segment is growing so fast that it's hard to ignore it. The whole world is looking at the U.S. craft industry going, how is this possible? And then we have some other, science and stuff like that. And the one thing we won't do and we won't have time for is tasting. I usually, if I travel to Russia, for instance, I bring a whole bunch of craft beers and just blow people's minds. Some of this you probably know, but it's always interesting to me. I get calls all the time, I should grow hops in California. Well, the best place to grow hops in the northern and southern hemisphere is between the 35th and 55th parallel, with right smack dab between 48 and 51 being the prime zone. And I love how that passes through through Oregon, Washington, passes through the Midwest, right through Michigan where I was going to school, right through the East Coast of New York, and then right into all the beer-drinking European nations, right? So it's no wonder hops became prevalent in our industry, and they grow really well over here in China and in Russia and things like that of that nature. So the fastest...
reasons for the preference? Why is
the
it?
daylight in the middle of summer
Okay.
is long. The longest day
Right.
is right there on the 48th or 49th parallel.
Yeah.
And hops are very sensitive to daylight hours. What little bits of land mass actually have the proper daylight. You know, in New Zealand, hops are wildly popular right now. The entire island there, both North and South Island, are pretty good. I actually visited there this year as well, and got to see the Nelson region where all those hops are grown. Australia has a growing hop industry, and Argentina actually grows Cascade. Is their most prevalent hop, and tastes nothing like our Cascade. In any case. You know, and just like, you know, farming all over the world, you know, hop growing is a multi-generational family operation. Most of the farms that you visit in the U.S. are 4 or 5 generations of hop growers. It's in the blood. It's been kind of somewhat at risk in recent generations because, you know, hop's becoming more and more a commodity, or alpha acid is becoming a commodity across the world. It's becoming more and more difficult to make that a viable business. But farming in general, I think, has been kind of under fire, so to speak. But of course, here in the United States, and you know this as well as I do, we have, you know, the Northwest being 99% of the hops grown in the United States, the Oregon Willamette Valley, the Washington Yakima Valley, and in Idaho. And this is actually growing quite a bit. And there's a little speck up there you see, and that was a farm originally started by Anheuser-Busch. It's called the Elk Mountain Ranch. AB is not growing hops anymore, and I think it's public knowledge, but the Gamesh farm, the same guys who grow Amarillo in the Yakima Valley, have now taken over this ranch to grow Amarillo up here. So you'll start seeing Idaho Amarillo and Washington Amarillo, and keep your eye open because they're distinctively different, and both are very nice for different reasons. This last year, we selected quite a bit of Idaho Amarillo for the first time. First time we got a chance at it. So there's a lot of planting going on there. Some very nice hops coming out of this region of Idaho as well here. And this is, you know, there's some really passionate young growers that are in it for the long haul and growing for craft brewers specifically. So I think you keep your eyes open and start paying attention if it's coming from Washington, is it coming from Oregon, or is it coming from Idaho? It becomes quite interesting. So I just snapped a picture out of a book I found that, you know, these were all the hop growing regions, you know, and as you know, the settlers pushed west, so did hop growing. You know, but the first hop farms were in New England area, in New York, Michigan. Here you see Wisconsin, which, you know, for years and years was the epicenter of, you know, industrial lager brewing in the world, correct? You know, and they're close to this very soft water source. You have St. Louis right down here, so there was hops obviously grown close to those brewers. But then California became a great producer. In the first half of the 1900s and up until the 60s, there was a lot of California cluster growing right here. A little bit outside of that premium zone of light, but obviously hops grow well here, and those of you who have had them in your garden, they grow very vigorously.
What part of California is that?
Well, you know, Sonoma County, Mendocino
I couldn't tell how
County.
far.
Yeah, it's not a very
west it
good
was.
picture, but you know, there's Hopland up there, and I couldn't tell you. I'm not from California originally, so couldn't. But it's close in that, you know, basically north of San Francisco area. But then it pushed north. The Willamette Valley, as it turns out, has a very Bavarian climate. The Yakima Valley has a climate similar to like Paso Robles. You know, it's arid, it's hot, it's brutal in the summer, but there's a lot of rivers flowing through that area, and thus there's plenty of irrigation. We'll hear a little bit more about the Yakima Valley is such a great growing region. Oh, this slide, I got ahead of myself. So what's cool about the U.S. industry as a whole is the fact that you've got 2 distinctively different, and with Idaho in the mix, really almost 3 distinctively different growing climates. You've got the Willamette Valley, which is a smaller growing region, relatively speaking, but it gets ample rainfall, so irrigation isn't necessary. Molds and things of that nature, mildews, are more prevalent, but it has a very Bavarian climate. And so hops like Mount Hood and Willamette, for that matter, were grown there to try to replicate hops like the Hallertau Mittelfrüh, for instance. And there was some success in that. Unfortunately, yields are lower in this valley, so when it comes to competition, Yakima really cleans up. And what's really unique about the Yakima Valley, and it's probably the only growing region in the world so far, that you can put hop rhizome in the ground first year and expect 85% yield. Wow. Whereas in the Willamette Valley, when you put a rhizome in the ground, first year you'll probably get nothing. Second year you might not get anything. You may have to wait 3 years before you get that kind of a yield. So as a result, I keep getting ahead of myself, but there's this diversity, as I mentioned, but this Yakima Valley being able to get 80 or 85% mature crop in the first year puts them at this huge advantage.
Yeah.
Mainly because, as you've seen, there's been this huge shift from high alpha, Columbus-style hops, old clusters and Galenas, to new age craft brew hops like Cascade and Centennial. And the guys on the Willamette Valley are really reluctant to change because they know they're going to be out of money for a couple of years, right, before they get back in a good harvest. Where in Yakima, they'll go till up a field, throw a new rhizome in, and be in business next year. Now, that's also led to some problems in our industry, and you may have even noticed this, and I certainly have in the time that I've been brewing, but hops like Cascade and Centennial seem to have been changing. And it's always hard to put your finger on it, and hop scientists are starting to realize a little bit more how to watch those changes. And it's not that the plant themselves are mutating, but it's that farmers are working too quickly to rip rhizomes out, put new rhizomes in. And again, if you've ever had them in your garden, you know what a voracious weed that thing is. It's hard to kill it if you really wanted to. And what happens is you get crosses within the field. And one hop that's stronger than both Cascade and Centennial is Cluster. It tends to hang on. And, I've heard a bunch of different ways to look at this, but one really simple thing is that when you look at an analysis of a Cascade, for instance, alpha and beta should almost be 1-to-1. And if you start to see something a little bit different, where alpha is 2 times beta and your alphas are going up, it's probably that there were enough cluster plants or something else in that field, high alpha, that it threw the numbers up. So it's a blend of actual hops, right? So there's been a push, and they've been doing this at Gail Goshi, who is a grower in Willamette, was the first one that I heard about this, but she went through, cleaned a field, let it lay fallow for a while to prove that there were no rhizomes, and then planted USDA pure rootstock of Cascade, and they grew that for Deschutes originally, Larry Sedora Deschutes, and kind of proved the point that, whoa, wait a second, yeah, this is the Cascade I remember. Whoa, and so I think there's a push now amongst growers that are growing specifically for craft brewers to start trying to purify these fields and get back to original rootstock. This is where I get to plug a different organization. I was one of the founding members of a 3, now maybe 4-year organization known as Hop Quality Group. And Hop Quality Group started as a group of about 6 craft brewers, and now has grown to a group of about 16. Some of the names that you'll recognize: Boulevard Brewing Company, Sierra Nevada, Deschutes, Firestone Walkers, of course, Stone, Bell's, Russian River, Schlafly's, Boston Beer Company. We got together, and much like the Hop Growers of America, we realized a couple things. Number one, when Anheuser-Busch got bought out by InBev, there was a disturbance in the force, I like to say. And love or hate Budweiser and Anheuser-Busch, at the end of the day, they were one of the most quality-driven companies the brewing world has ever seen. Now, you may not like the end product, but all of the research, hop selection, and they held these super high standards for their growers, both in barley and in hops. And they literally had a team of, I think, 3 or 4 full-time hop quality people that lived and worked in Yakima and just spent time interfacing with farmers, doing simple things like, hey, making sure they had bird netting up around their kilns, or making sure that, they cleaned, the tractor didn't drive through manure somewhere and then drove into the hop field. And really kind of convinced farmers and pushed this whole almost like FDA-type activity in the hop yards. When InBev came in, they fired a lot of different departments, but one of the first departments that was let go was the entire hop quality group. And the leader of that group was a guy by the name of Val Peacock. And if you geek out on hops enough and read enough scientific literature, that name starts popping up a lot. He's probably, for sure, the leading scientist in the United States for the last couple decades. Of course, he was hired, and his job was with Anheuser-Busch. But, you know, I was up at a Master Brewers Association meeting over beers, talking to a couple craft brewers, and I said, you know, we could be really up shit creek here, because as craft brewers, we've been kind of riding the tails of Anheuser-Busch for all these years based on quality. I never go to Yakima, you know, I don't inspect hop fields. Or Peacock retires, are we all going to be screwed? Are hops going to go a whole different direction than we want as craft brewers? Not to mention, we dry hop. 50% of Firestone beers are dry hopped. If I'm taking raw hops from the field and throwing them into my finished beer, I mean, pest, you know, control, what are you using? You know, sanitation, what are you doing? You know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, and literally over the beers we said, wouldn't it be cool if we could hire Val Peacock? Ha, 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 right? 3 years later, we each pooled, we each threw $5,000 into the bin, and we hired Val Peacock. And Val Peacock and these breweries formed what we call Hop Quality Group. Non-for-profit again. We don't talk about money. We can't talk about, you know, what it costs for hops, or try to get together and buy hops. But we have a common goal of raising the bar for quality and holding it there for craft brewers. Using Val Peacock's knowledge, we wrote a best practices manual for growers in the United States. We're going to try to do that for European growers as well. And also a best practice manual for brewers, which we haven't completed yet, which is, what do you do once you buy hops? Do you refrigerate them? Do you freeze them? You know, what do you do when you open them? What do they look like, etc.? How do you select? So it's funny, you know, when I was a homebrewer, I had no idea how deep kind of all that kind of activity was going on with the big brewers. I always assumed big brewers didn't care. They just tried to make the cheapest beer possible. But in fact, they're the leading brewer in the world. AB was one of the best quality drivers in the world. And when InBev came in, unfortunately, I didn't want to say they shut all quality down, but they had a different focus. The focus was on not hops, unfortunately. I'm not going to throw them under the bus or anything, but that's kind of fact.
Was part of that with AB and getting I thought that was part of the reason they called it the Champagne of Beers, was because in like the Grand Cru area of Champenois in France, they are trying those specific like Veuve Clicquot and Moet. They try and get that taste consistent every year as possible.
Oh my gosh.
So how else could you do it but quality?
Oh my gosh.
Right?
And AB
yeah.
at their peak, and probably still today, because they were making over 50 million barrels of beer in the United States. They had 12 breweries, and it was always said that Augie Busch would have a bottle from every brewery shipped in, and he would personally taste them and throw a fit.
If he could taste the difference,
exactly.
Right? Yeah.
It was all about, every brewery had a flavor match. They used a blend of something like 12 different hops. Now, I never tasted a hop in a Budweiser in my life.
Whether you like it or not, it is most consistent.
There's a free book. Charles something. He's the he does the brewing classes at.
Bamford.
Yeah, he has a free book online that talks a lot about how Anheuser-Busch did that. He worked for them.
And again, I think everyone thought maybe they were anything but quality, because they were the biggest and the craziest, industrial lager brewer. I mean, they're using Beechwood chips, all these different things that they did for quality, and whether or not you taste it relative, all things are relative, right? You taste it next to a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale and it tastes like water. If you taste it next to a Miller or a Schlitz or I don't know what beer you want to compare it to. So, I don't know how many, has anybody been up to Yakima or Willamette Valley?
Yeah, my brother lives there.
Oh, okay. Well, so these pictures, and I can even turn out the light here so you can see better for a little bit. These are just some pictures that I took at different stages in the hop growing process that I think are kind of interesting. So this is very, very early in the spring. So, when harvesting hops, as you probably know, they're cut all the way down to the ground, and it's the rhizome that lives just slightly below the surface that stays alive, goes dormant in the winter, and then comes and sprouts back up in the spring. So this is what a hop yard would look like in the spring, and you see the residuals of the twine that had been strung in that field to allow the vine to grow up. So that's what it kind of looks like. And this would be rootstock that would be ready for planting. You can see there's some budding already occurring on the rhizome, and there's a big reason why it's such a voracious weed, is that you can throw a chunk of woody rhizome in the ground and it will blast off, especially with the right conditions. And so that's typically the way a baby hop yard would be sown. Now, if a grower is trying to grow, say, a new variety, Mosaic or something like that, and there's not a lot of woody rhizome available, they might propagate that
Okay.
in a greenhouse.
As an actual plant that would go
Yep,
into the ground.
and they can take cuttings of plants and graft, or not graft, but root.
Propagated.
Yep,
yeah.
root propagate. It's rare that would ever be done from seed. Seed is typically part of the breeding process, and males are eliminated through the entire process
Yeah.
otherwise, so you shouldn't
Yeah.
have seed and wouldn't typically use it for propagation. So then, you string the field for every vine that you want to stretch. Those vines are going to grow approximately 18 feet in a U.S. yard. And I can't remember how many meters it is in a German yard. I think they slightly are taller and ours are slightly shorter. But in any case, you get an idea for how, I always say it's a vineyard on steroids. Those poles are probably 20-foot poles. And as you can imagine, a yard can get pretty big, and in windstorms it's susceptible to getting blown over if there's big storms and things of that nature. So then this is a field that's probably mid-June or so, and you can see that every farmer is a little bit different. Oftentimes, just like in vineyards, you may see some cover crop, or you may see it completely disked clean. When I went to New Zealand, they let the sheep loose in the hop yards, and they'll clean as high as they can reach.
Wow.
And that keeps pests from coming up.
Right.
And they do that on purpose, plus they fertilize. New Zealand still is predominantly organic, whether they're certified organic or not, but because they have very few natural pests to hops, they've done a very good job of keeping pests out. They have the sheep to fertilize. They have ample water. They don't really apply much of anything in New Zealand, which is amazing. Yakima and Willamette, they apply a lot. They have to do a lot of fungicides, and they have spider mites, and they have aphids, and a lot of the common things that are in our gardens as well, they're fighting off. But it takes a massive amount of water, a massive amount of infrastructure, just like a vineyard, which you're probably familiar with, and a lot of maintenance. This is actually a picture of the few of us from the Hop Quality Group. Larry Sador, formerly of Deschutes, now of Crux. This gentleman used to be with Val Peacock at AB, and now he's at Odell's. This is Stephen Powell from Boulevard Brewing. This guy's from New Belgium. That's Val Peacock right there. This is Tom Nielsen, and that's another name that you'll hear more and more about. He's a young scientist at Sierra Nevada, who is, again, one of the cutting-edge hop scientists in the world. And he works for Sierra Nevada, which I always go, how am I supposed to compete with those guys? Smart dudes like that working for him. This is just a close-up of the vine, or vine you might hear it referred to as it's climbing clockwise up the rope. I'm told they go counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere, but I have never. It's like a toilet flush, but I'm not sure.
I'm sure everyone believes.
Yeah,
in that.
exactly. So these are some young cones, and this is probably looking more and more familiar to you. I'm sure you've all seen these pictures before too, and some mature cones. So then when it comes time to harvest, every farm has slightly different implements that they use, but the process is all relatively the same. So this gentleman is driving down the rows and cutting every vine off with the string and everything right at the ground with this cutting device. And then coming in behind him is this harvester, which is unique to the hop growing industry, so that it can cut the vine free from the top wire and drop it down into some type of truck or trailer. There are some farms that use combines, these giant 20-foot tall, they look like something from Star Wars, and they'll actually strip the cones off the vine in the field. But I would say more than 75–80% of the industry does it this way, where they take the entire vine, all the leaf, all the vine, the string, everything, lay it in a truck, and then take it to a stationary picker in some kind of a barn somewhere on the farm. And so this is a picture of a picker. And again, there are these really bizarre devices specific to hops. And that's another part, it's, when I get these phone calls from, gentleman farmer in the Central Coast, she's like, hey, I hear hops are hot, can I grow some hops for you? And I'm like, well, if I was making a wet hop beer or a fresh hop beer, yes. But, do you have a picker? Do you have a kiln? Do you have a baler? Do you have a pelletizer? You got a freezer? You got all, and they're like, whoa, what is that?
Yeah.
Well, when you have those things, then I can buy from you. So, this is a pretty common picker, and you'll see pictures of it, but the vine gets strung up and dragged through this device, and all of the cones and leaves are picked off the vine. So here you see the vines being hooked into the conveying device and into the picker. You can imagine the smell in one of these places. You should go to Yakima if you're a beer fan, just to smell Hop Harvest. It's just amazing. So then this is, you can kind of get a feel for, there's some fingers that are on conveyors that pick and shred. And then basically there's a whole bunch of what look like complete torture devices that will separate vine and leaf from cone. And this is an example of that. So it's, just separation devices of sorts. Then ultimately it needs to go to a kiln. And this is a very common kiln in the United States, what we call a single deck kiln. Some of them have floors that look almost like water tun floors. Basically it's a perforated floor. And the hops are loaded into these kilns. Bed depth would range somewhere, almost like a lauter bed. It'd be somewhere between a foot, maybe 2 feet deep. Could be even deeper. So here the hops are being conveyed into the kiln, and then this device is trying to spread them out evenly across the floor. And then here you go. They're laid in the kiln. There's dormers above to allow the vapor and heat to rise. And there's large furnaces. They may be driven by diesel, they may be driven by fuel oil or natural gas. Hop Quality Group prefers natural gas for all the obvious reasons. These are like giant burners. If you're familiar with boilers or even the heater you have at home, it's just like a giant version of that. So it's driving a lot of air, a lot of BTUs underneath the floor. So the kiln is up here. This is driving heat, forced heat under the kiln. They watch temperature. The old rule of thumb to keep it at 145 degrees. Hop Quality Group has been running some studies at 130, 135, finding better results. In other words, not vaporizing oils. But in any case, they need to watch temperature, the amount of air, and ultimately you're taking a plant that comes off the vine at 70 or 80% water, and you're bringing it down to approximately 10% water. And you're trying to do that in 12 hours or something like this. Every kiln's a little bit different.
Is that what they usually pack at, about 10% humidity?
So you're going to see, if you were to see a hop analysis, you should see numbers in and around 10% plus or minus 1%.
Okay.
Some hop varieties are very, very particular about the temperature or the moisture content. I can't remember if I have slides of it, but there's this phenomena that is basically what's the word for it? Spontaneous combustion. And it doesn't seem real, but you can take, and CTZ Columbus is famous for this. You get it down to a known moisture, but you don't get it dry enough. You leave it just slightly too moist. You put it in a bale, and it starts to do that kind of fermentation in the middle, and it will literally explode and burst into flames as soon as it sees oxygen.
Yeah, alfalfa will do that.
Yep.
Yes.
So yeah, if you bale things like that, then you're familiar. That happens with hops. So they need to really dial that moisture in before they bale, and then get the bales cold as quickly as possible.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there anyone doing like extended drying without like 70 degrees?
Yeah, there's so much experimentation going on, and so what happens is that, especially in the U.S., these farms are large. They're 500 to 1,000 acre farms.
Yeah, they gotta move.
And if they and everything's being picked at once, it's kind of like a winery with this giant vineyard. I mean, they've got their crush pad. They need to process so many, tons of grapes, or they're going to leave some in the field, right? So some of it's by the nature of just trying to get everything processed at once. But there are some smaller growers who are doing all sorts of experimentation like that. Yeah, or trying to do this in inert gas environments. I mean, there's all sorts of really interesting experimentation, whether it can be used, at the end of the day, when you're, and I'm not a farmer, but I just know from dealing with them so long, there's certain things you can just do and you can't do based on finances, time, and, you want to buy me that system, let's do it. So they'll come off the kiln, and typically they'll go into a giant pile to cool. So they get them off the kiln. Once they get them to moisture, you want to get them off the kiln and cool them down as quickly as possible. And so you'll see these giant piles, and you've probably seen pictures of brewers diving into these piles and stuff like that. But
now, are they cooled naturally, or
they're just cooled in the air.
To the air. Okay.
There may be experimentation going with doing that cooling, because from this point forward, the longer that hop is exposed to oxygen, high temperatures, you're going to start losing
Lose
oils.
oils, yes.
Yeah. So the clock is ticking. So from that pile then, the hops would be put into a baler, and typically those bales are either just a straight ahead burlap, which there's a lot of air movement through that burlap, or it can be this semi-mylar. It's almost like a burlap made of mylar, which is a synthetic, but it still allows some breathing,
right? Yes.
some breathing. But just by the nature of those whole leaf hops in a bale with air entrained, you can only imagine that if you don't keep it really cold or frozen, it is going to oxidize quite quickly and the oils are going to change. And then from the baler, it would then go onto a truck, and typically, unless you're a really big-time farmer that does have direct contacts with the likes of, say, Sierra Nevada or large breweries that buy a lot of whole leaf hop, they may go directly to a brewer, but more times than not, it's going to go then to a broker. A broker or a processor. Again, there are some farmers who do processing to pellets, but most of the time it's happening with some kind of either co-op, like a Hop Union, or a Steiner, or a Haas. They're processing the great majority of the hops that are harvested in the United States.
Well, isn't that because of cost to that? I mean, to set up a whole other operation to pelletize, I mean, when I was on one of the farms, when I was visiting, that's what he said. He said, look, we couldn't even afford to think about setting up a whole...
And it wasn't until the whole craft brewing... Well, I shouldn't say this, but I think that craft brewing changed the business because we're willing to pay almost twice as much as the big brewers. Paying $8 for a pound of Amarillo isn't unheard of. And, trust me, AB wasn't paying $8 a beer. They're paying about $2 a pound. And so that suddenly changes the economics, and farmers can now afford to do some of the processing themselves, or maybe change the way they kill them because we're willing to pay more. So that, I think, and then the trickle-down effect is that the smaller brewers like myself and the home brewers out there are going to see the advantages of this, if you haven't already. I think hops just keep getting better and better. You're getting fresher hops, turnover's there. There's excitement in the industry. You're willing to pay more. It works really well for everybody. So this is part of that whole thing. So once the hops, this is at Hop Union. These are all big freezer rooms, but before they'll let them into the freezer room, they are all checked. And the bales are laid out like this, out in daylight, and they go through and probe every one of them with a temperature probe to make sure that
they're not fermenting,
spontaneous combustion isn't occurring, because they could put that in their big warehouse, it blows up, and then they lose everything.
No kidding.
And it seems like every couple of years there's a big warehouse fire. And they're dangerous, but more importantly, they destroy a lot of really
great hops.
So they'll sit outside until they're sure, they're checked. A plug is taken out of every single bale, and that's sent to do seed analysis, pest analysis, and USDA gets involved. USDA gets involved in that. I'm really short, so I make bales really big. And then this is a pellet plant. It's a very small one. It's Indy Hops in Oregon. It's a real clean plant, and it's kind of hard to see all the different components in that picture, but every pellet plant seems slightly different. But the name of the game is to essentially break up the bale, hammer mill it into a powder, then take that powder and run it through a pellet die, keeping the die as cool as you possibly can, so you generate heat in that process of getting doing damage. And then once you create a pellet, getting it into a mylar or vacuum or nitrogen flush package as quickly as possible.
Where did you get the name of that from?
This is Indy Hops, and they're the only pelletizing operation I'm aware of in Oregon. So up until the time they're a small craft brew oriented organization that kind of saw an opportunity when craft brewing kind of took off. And also that there was nobody processing hops at all anymore in Oregon. Everything was being sent to Yakima.
That's in the Willows.
It's right. I couldn't tell you the town. Everything's in and around kind of that whole Corvallis, Salem, Central Oregon region. So let's see. I can keep yakking for a little while. I think you know a lot of this kind of basic information, but traditionally the U.S. was the leading producer of high alphas for many, many years, and the U.S. was known as an alpha producer. And what does that mean? Well, these are hops that are used for bittering, or these hops are taken and processed into some type of extract, put in a can, and sent all over the world. And in fact, about 80%, 70 to 80% of the U.S. crop is exported.
Wow.
Yep. So, and the vast majority of that is CTZ, Columbus, Zeus, Tomahawk, which is all the same genetics, and people tried to trademark the name and realize they're all the hops grown in the U.S. are CTZ. Now that's changing. It's changing rapidly because of craft brewing. But if you talked about this 10 years ago, it was U.S. is good for alpha, Germany is good for aroma. Even though you and I think of Cascade and other aroma hops coming from the U.S., the greater brewing world, you got to remember craft brewing is 6% of the U.S. market, which is a fraction of the world market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but anyway, today, both Germany and the U.S., and I always use Germany as the one to kind of compare to, are both growing a well-balanced portfolio of high alpha and aroma hops. And again, out of the U.S. brewing program or U.S. Breeding program, the hops that have become very famous around the world from the U.S. are Cascade, Willamette, Mount Hood, Sterling. Now, we know there's a whole plethora of new age hops, but these old, Cascade's still super popular around the world. Willamette is as well. So this is kind of a 2011, so it's a little dated, but the statistics really haven't changed too much, with the exception that China is growing very, very fast. If you would have looked at this in 2006 or 7, China would have been included in other, and they wouldn't even had a sliver of the pie. The brewing industry, the two places that's growing the fastest right now are Africa and China. China, again, a decade ago, produced less beer than the United States. The United States produces about 250 million barrels, or 250 million barrels of beer a year. China now produces over 500 million barrels. I mean, it's growing so fast that they now doubled the United States in total beer production.
Has craft brewing caused the beer consumption in the United States to go up?
Again, being only 6% of the whole pie, I think that beer consumption is pretty much flat. Craft brew is growing by double digits, which means that the big brewers are slightly down.
Well, I know I've helped a lot this last couple
But again,
months.
6% is, again, it's all relative, right? Well, 6% of the volume, more than 10% of the revenue. That's another interesting tidbit there.
China increasing mainly because of cost?
China has this growing middle class. And wherever in the world a middle class develops, beer follows. It's amazing. Alcoholic beverage consumption.
That they're not brewing for like major companies in America.
I don't think there's a lot of export.
So it's their own
Yeah,
stuff
there's these
that's just
brands that
growing.
you've never heard of that are larger than Anheuser-Busch.
Well, you have to look at the population, it's
billions now.
A lot of people.
Right. And that's what's happening in Africa. There's a growing middle class. That's what happened in South America 10 years, 15 years ago. And wherever there's a middle class, boom, beer's right there behind it. And the likes of Heineken, InBev, who am I forgetting? Carlsberg. They're the first ones in, it seems like. China's done a pretty good job of nurturing and growing their own domestic.
They don't like to have anything else.
Right. But there's a lot of focus. Like if you talk to German brewing equipment manufacturers, they're selling a ton of equipment in China and Africa right now. So anyway, the other thing to look at though is that U.S. and Germany are almost neck and neck, controlling 35 to 40% each. So 80% of the pie is these two countries, and the rest of the world. The U.K. used to be considered one of the great producers, and now there's less than 2,000 acres in the ground in the U.K. I mean, just nothing, really nothing, nothing coming out of there. You hear a lot about Slovenian and Czech Saaz, very little acreage overall. I mean, they don't show up as even 5% of the total. The most famous hops in the world, and very little of them grow in East Kent Holdings, for instance. I'll just keep plowing through maybe for another 10 minutes or so, but basically what this shows is the fact that demand of hops, which is kind of like the demand of beer, although IBUs in beer over time has continued to go down and down. Turn of the century 1900, the average beer was 30 IBUs. You look at the average beer in the world right now, it's about 8 to 10 IBUs. So we're almost a third, and really, IBUs equals alpha. Now we're using a lot of downstream products with high utilization. We're growing high alpha hops, whereas the average hop alpha probably in 1900 was between 3 and 5% alpha. Now we have cultivars like Hercules that are 20% alpha. So the world has changed. An acre produces a lot more alpha than it used to. That doesn't mean it produces that much more hop, but it produces a lot
A
more,
little more alpha,
alpha.
yeah.
So anyway, alpha demand has kind of, ebbed and flowed a little, but it stayed pretty. But look at,
Pretty
the
consistent,
production of alpha
yeah,
is
hello.
back and forth across that line, and that's the boom and bust nature of agronomics and farming, right? It's a real reactive industry. It's like, oh, hops are $10 a pound. I'll pull my soybeans out and throw hop yard in, that kind of activity. Or, you know what, $2 a pound for hops, I'm out of the hop business, I'll plant corn. And that's the kind of thing that you see. And what ends up happening in the modern world is that farmers who have excess hops produce extract. Extract can sit on a shelf for years. And so you get these buildups of alpha. That doesn't do anything for us craft brewers,
Right.
but there's alpha for the greater brewing world, and farmers start pulling on his business, and that's why we see our hops go up in price. And then when alpha demand drives the greater price of hops.
Hops, yeah. Makes
So
sense.
if you were homebrewing trying to buy hops in 2007, 2008, 2009, when we had the hop crisis, that's what
Good
happened.
luck.
That was right there.
Yeah.
Production was way below demand, and it just created, if you were to look at the price of hops, you'd see this corresponding giant spike right there. It kind of caught us all by surprise. This is kind of interesting because 2001 versus 2011. In 1991 versus 2011. This is when Anheuser-Busch was still buying aroma hops. And this is after Anheuser-Busch stopped buying aroma hops. and you know how much craft brewing grew between that time, and that's why we didn't have a net effect. The aroma hops grown in the world was cut in half when Anheuser-Busch stopped using aroma hops in their beer, and that's when InBev purchased them.
Jeez.
Did it change the nature of the beer by doing that?
I don't drink
I
Budweiser.
don't drink it.
Apparently
I've got a few
not,
in my
because they're still
life,
selling a
but-
lot of beer.
Yeah.
And that's one of those interesting parts of brewing science. Unfortunately, in some styles of beer, you can do those kind of things and get away with it. Or maybe it's the consumer base not paying enough attention.
Right.
Yeah, sure, because I know a lot of old
Well,
men
and
used
if
to
they
drink and
slowly
quit,
change
and then they,
it,
like,
you know,
on occasion would have a beer now, and they're like, that's not a book.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So
That's completely
it's
different
hard
from what I
to be-
remember.
Like I said, I try not to throw any big brewer under the bus because we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't
That's
for the
right.
big brewers. But there are those interesting facts. Beer production in millions of hectoliters is definitely, this kind of answers your question before, worldwide is going up. And it's not because U.S. Drinkers are drinking more beer, it's because China,
The world
Africa,
is
the world is,
consuming.
there's a larger and larger middle class around the world. And it's, so, this means job security for me. I'll find a job somewhere in the world, right? Not happening here. But hops under cultivation in the world is, if anything, kind of in a downward trend. And that's back to the IBUs dropping, high alpha hops being grown, and this fact that you can warehouse alpha in the form of an extract and hold on to it for long periods of time. And that just doesn't bode well for farmers, right? They see these kind of trends, they're like, why would I want to stay in
It seems
this
so weird to
business?
think of that, because if you just think if you're used to drinking craft beers, you just realize that
Well,
it's more and more about higher and higher hop rates. in
More
the beers.
beer, less hops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and then so in the craft brew industry, we're kind of insulated in this completely different world. And it's taken a while for hop growers to react to craft brewers. But it's happening. Trust me, it's alive and well. Farmers realize they can make more money selling to craft brewers, and craft brewers are for real. The likes of Lagunitas are buying more hops than some million-barrel industrial brewer.
Well, it seems like also InBev is kind of reacting because like they bought Goose Island, right? And I don't think it's changed.
No.
People are still raving about their beer.
And they're making a heck of a lot more of it. A lot more.
Yeah, quite right.
I'll just do a couple more slides because they're interesting, but this is hop production in metric tons. Again, it just follows this hop acres under cultivation. It peaked up here after the hop crisis. Everybody thought they were going to get rich growing hops, and then realized real quickly the same amount of beer was being produced for the most part. And alpha production in metric tons. It's this rocky mountain ride of highs and lows, and it's hard to keep your... And these slides were meant to show brewers to convince them to do long-term contracts.
Yeah.
It's like, do you want to follow the spot market roller coaster ride, or do you want to just promise me that you'll buy hops from me for 5 years and have a steady price across it?
That's right.
And at least in the craft brewing industry, when I got in, nobody contracted because the price of hops just kept going lower and lower every year. And the more we bought, the better the deal. So we were completely oblivious to hop contracts until the crisis hit and the price tripled. And then we all learned our
Yeah,
lesson, and now
or you couldn't allocate
every
any.
pound of hop that Firestone Walker uses is under contract,
Okay.
in long-term contracts, 3 to 5
Most people
years.
doing that after '07?
Yeah. And
Yeah, it
even
makes
small little
sense.
pub breweries that use 2 44-pound boxes a year are forced to contract just to make sure they
They
get their
their,
hops.
yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah.
And there are there are brokers that are set up like Hop Union that are set up to deal with
smaller
And I know
trucks,
if you're doing the buying of hops for the shop,
Mm-hmm.
I mean you probably find that if you're watching spot, the price can be just
Oh, it changes,
you know,
yeah.
all over. So contracting becomes really, really important, even if it's for small volumes. So what are we looking at here? I'm a little lost. So alpha production, crop year versus alpha demand. It's just another version of the, production's up and down and demand is kind of flat, but ever increasing right now. So maybe I'll just kind of leave it with some of the actual harvest statistics. This was a result of reacting to the hop crisis. We pulled a lot of hops out and rearranged hops to be more aroma-driven for the craft brewers as on the whole. Time to get going?
Wrap it up in like 5.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that for sure. I'll stand up here and talk all night if you let me. In total production in kilos here you can see. So it looks like we're producing less, but honestly this was a balancing act. The years prior to this it was even lower, and it did this escalation, and now we're kind of getting back into what a balanced portfolio of what the industry really needs. But the message that Hop Quality Group is sending to hop growers of America is that craft brewers are growing at this double-digit, and aroma hops need to go in the ground to support that activity, or we as craft brewers are also going to be in a crisis again here. It's always a little sketchy, and that's why this contracting becomes just such a critical part of the game. It's just really, the last 10 slides are all about the volatility of the hop world and how weird it is, and it's a global market. It has really almost nothing to do with the craft brewing industry in the United States. It has everything to do with this global market that really drives all those undercurrents. So I'll probably leave it at that.